In this session, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the regional development of the icon. While it is true that the writing of an icon is a very restrictive art form and one where tradition allows little scope for the imagination of the individual artist, it is not true that icons are uniform either across time or space. As the theology of the icon developed, so did the icons themselves. As new saints entered into glory, so new icons were written to represent them. Icons written in one culture could be markedly different from icons written in another. This variation is to be expected as part of the glorious diversity of God's people. It does not mean that the Church suppresses the specific character of the cultural elements which it adopts. It excludes nothing which is part of the nature created by God, not one human trait, not one indication of time and place, not one national or personal characteristic. It sanctifies all the diversity of the universe, revealing to it its true meaning, orienting it towards the true end, the building up of the kingdom of God. Cultural diversity does not violate the unity of the Church, but offers it new forms of expression. Thus, the Catholicity of the Church is confirmed both in cultural wholeness and in the individual details. In the realm of art, just in other areas, Catholicity does not mean uniformity, but rather the expression of one truth in a variety of forms, characteristic of every people, of every epoch, of every human being. There is a main line of tradition which has developed. This is the tradition that began in Byzantium and was passed via the Balkans to Russia. When people speak of Christian icons, they normally mean images from this tradition. There is also a surprisingly complex relationship between the icons of the Eastern Church and the devotional religious art of the Western Church. This interreaction is strongest in the border kingdoms such as Cyprus and Romania. Other traditions, such as the Coptic and Ethiopian, tend to be of local importance only. Now let's talk a little about the Byzantine style. The beginnings of the Byzantine style can be traced at least to the rule of the Emperor Justinian, and can be seen in the mosaics of San Vitale in Ravenna, and in mosaic fragments from Sancta Sophia, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. A large group of devotional images has also been preserved in the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. The style involves figures with a dignified bearing and with prominent eyes, looking past the viewer into eternity, so to speak. After the iconoclast controversy, old techniques had to be re-evaluated. Mosaics were still used, but encaustic, that is the wax colour techniques, these gave way to the use of egg tempera. Since the cult of icons played a leading part in both religious and secular life, an important aspect of Byzantine artistic activity was the painting of devotional panels. Icon painting afforded little scope for individuality, since the effectiveness of the religious image as a vehicle of divine presence was held to depend on its fidelity to an established prototype. The development of Byzantine painting may also be seen in manuscript illumination. Byzantine achievements in mosaics brought this art to an unprecedented and unsurpassed level of grandeur and expressive power. Mosaics were applied to nearly all of the available surfaces of Byzantine churches, but in an established hierarchical order. The centre of the dome was reserved for the representation of the Pantocrator, or Jesus as the ruler of the universe, whereas other sacred personages occupied lower spaces in descending order of importance. The entire church thus served as a tangible evocation of the heavenly, of the celestial order. This conception was further enhanced by the stylized poses and gestures of the figures, their hieratic gaze and the luminous shimmer of the gold backgrounds. The Amorium dynasty, who ruled from 820 to 867, saw change in the Byzantine Empire. It became more Greek and was reorganized in a way that brought church and state into harmony. This led to the establishment of elite icon workshops that used ivory, gold and enamel. There was also an increasing influence from both Sasanian Persian and Islamic culture. The subsequent history of the empire saw a gradual decline in the quality of the icons and a shift in style away from dignified detachment. However, the late mosaics and frescoes of the Hora church in Constantinople, executed in 1313, are amongst the finest examples of Byzantine art. Legend has it that some of these were still being painted while the gates of the city were being bombarded. The sacred figures here are characterized by an energy, a sense of movement, and a strange inner agitation, which is absent from earlier works. One region where the Byzantine style could survive and develop without the disruption of Islamic rule was Mount Athos. This peninsula in northern Greece became a place of retreat for monks and hermits from the 9th century onwards. In 1046, it was officially recognised, and even the Turks in general recognised its sovereignty as a monastic republic. The monks saw themselves as the caretakers of an unbroken tradition. Artists came to Mount Athos from Greece and the Greek islands, including Cyprus and Crete, and even from the Venetian Empire from the 11th century. In later times, all Orthodox nations developed monastic communities at Mount Athos, and this has resulted in a richness and diversity of iconographic style. Now let's discuss the Balkans in a little more detail. Thessaloniki was the most important Byzantine city after Constantinople in the late Empire. It was also of great significance because it was on the Balkan Peninsula, an area where both Rome and Byzantium interacted with Slavic tribes. It was here that orthodoxy was first passed to the Slavic peoples. A priest called Constantine, later named Cyril, invented the Old Slavic or Church Slavonic alphabet to give the voiceless Slavic peoples a voice. Cyril and his brother Methodius were iconophiles during the iconoclast period and passed the reverence for icons as well as the Byzantine style on to the Christian Slavic tribes. This was very fruitful in that it led to the establishment of icon schools in the surrounding countries, in Bulgaria and Serbia in particular, and ultimately to the great icon schools of the Russian lands. In Bulgaria, the city of Ohrid achieved early prominence, as is evidenced by the 11th century frescoes in the church of Hagia Sophia. Icons from the Ohrid school are marked by a certain elegance and restraint. The elaborate richness of the Byzantine style is subdued somewhat by exposure to native forms, and the result is the creation of a distinct national style. The city of Trnovo became a major centre of icon painting in the 13th and 14th centuries, and underwent a renaissance in the 19th. Icons from Tirnovo, which maintained a pure conservative style, helped to maintain a national religious identity even during Turkish domination. Serbian art was deeply influenced by political and religious turmoil. Its first independent ruler, the Grand Duke Stefan Nemanja, was a political foe of Byzantium, although he was greatly in awe of the Byzantine culture. This led to the adoption of Byzantine religious norms, even though Serbia remained fiercely independent. Most Serbian icons are of a simple Slavic style, but many also show evidence of competition between the realism of early Western Gothic elements and the formal idealism of late Byzantine or Greek elements. One other notable feature of Serbian iconography was the emphasis on tender human images of Mary and her child. This was in response to the heretical threat of the Bogomils, whose rejection of the Incarnation precluded this kind of relationship between Mary and her son Jesus. There was also a great fondness for military saints such as St. George. The development of Serbian iconography effectively ended in 1389, when the area was overrun by the Turks, although of course there were still icons painted in rural villages. While in no way denying the local importance of the iconic art of the Balkans or even the significance of this art for the wider Christian community, it is probably true to say that the most significant outcome of the iconography of the Balkans was that it was the vehicle by which the tradition of Byzantium was passed on to the Russian lands, and it was in the Russian lands, freed from the influence of the Islamic Turkish Empire, that most of the later development in iconic art occurred. Now let us speak of the tradition of Rus. Christian Rus began in Kiev with the baptism of Grand Duke Vladimir in 988, and in spite of the attacks of the Mongols and the rule of the Tatars and almost constant internal squabbles, a relatively continuous development of indigenous iconography was possible. According to the authors Uspensky and Lorsky, it was in Russia that the finest flowering of the icon tradition was achieved. They wrote, "It is indeed given to Russia to produce that perfection of the pictorial language of the icon, which revealed with such great force the depth of meaning of the liturgic image, its spirituality. It can be said that if Byzantium was preeminent in giving the world theology expressed in words, theology expressed in images was given preeminently by Russia." Despite legends of very early icons, the beginnings of Russian iconography can be traced to the large-scale church art, both mosaics and frescoes, in Kiev and Novgorod. Examples of this can be seen in the Cathedral of Holy Wisdom in Kiev. Icons began to be imported from Greece, and indigenous schools then developed. Important here was the founding of the Monastery of the Caves, the Pecheskaya Lavra, the beginning of Russian monasticism. Grand Duke Andrei left Kiev in the 12th century to establish a new capital, Vladimir, and what would eventually become the Principality of Tver. It was here that the Feast of the Protecting Veil of the Mother of God was first proclaimed, and the icon for this feast was first written. Kiev was conquered and destroyed by the Mongols in 1240. It was some centuries before it could recover to again play an important part in Russian cultural life. Novgorod is the second of the ancient centres of Rus Christianity, and St. Sophia, the Cathedral of Holy Wisdom, was first built there in 989. Located in the northwest of Russia, close to the Finnish borderlands, Novgorod was a fiercely independent and strong-willed city of merchants. The city-state was only brought under the rule of Moscow by Ivan the Terrible in 1570, with the most appalling violence. Novgorod sponsored the development of a large number of icon workshops, whose icons were, to quote Uspensky and Lorsky again, as lucid and unambiguous in composition and colouring as the business ledgers of the merchants who commissioned the works. The faces often show the influence of the native Finnish population, and St. Nicholas is very much a favourite subject. Pskov is a smaller city within the territory of Novgorod, whose icons have a marked sombre atmosphere caused by the use of sulfuric arsenic in the paint. Now, St. Andrei Rublev is arguably the most famous of all iconographers. His icon of the Holy Trinity, portrayed as the hospitality of Abraham, the Philoxenia, was written to affirm the Orthodox understanding of the Holy Trinity, and it has become famous with copies spreading across both national and denominational borders. St. Andrei Rublev lived between 1360 and 1427. He was a monk of the Andronikov monastery in Moscow, which he only left to do commissioned work. All his icons are marked by a restrained and simple style, which is seen as an expression of the asceticism of his life. This is particularly marked when compared to his famous contemporaries or near contemporaries such as Theophanes the Greek, an immigrant escaping from the Turkish assault on Byzantium, who brought the skilled, elegant and expressive style of late Byzantium, and Dionysius, a layman who visualized the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome with his complex biographical icons of major church figures. Dionysius is also well known for his Marian icons. So, Rublev, Theophanes and Dionysius represent the major strands in Russian icon writing: the monastic schools, the Greek influence and the secular or state workshops respectively. The Moscow school arose from these diverse sources. It can really only be spoken of as a school because of the central political importance of Moscow. Beginning under the rule of the Tatars and finally confirmed under the brutal rule of Ivan the Terrible in the middle of the late 16th century, Moscow became the political and cultural capital of the Russian Empire. The icons produced by this school represent a great elaboration of the simple prototypes. These icons will often contain large numbers of people, intricate detail and a strong narrative sense. They also show a strong political influence. This is perhaps best represented by the icon of the Church Triumphant, which shows various Russian military leaders, including Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, marching in procession to heaven at the head of their armies. Significant amongst the iconographers of the Moscow school was Simon Ushakov. He worked in the Kremlin Chamber of Icons, a major state-sponsored icon workshop which also produced other paintings as required by the state. This school was heavily influenced by Western art. It introduced a realistic representation of the figures and of their surrounds, three-dimensional space, and a concept of divine beauty, all borrowed from the Baroque of Western Europe. While the overall form of the icon was maintained, its meaning and purpose was shifted. These icons were intended not so much for instruction and contemplation as to impress. It is interesting to compare the complexity of the icon of the Holy Trinity written by Ushakov with the simplicity of the one written by St. Andrei. That this school was also required to produce commercial portraits of secular figures was probably one major catalyst for these developments. However, Ushakov also argued strongly that icons should be the best art available, and that this was the three-dimensional representative art of the West. He considered that foreigners would laugh at Russian art if it continued with the traditional icon style. This westernizing trend was continued when the capital moved to St. Petersburg in 1703. St. Petersburg was very much more cosmopolitan, and here icons were painted in oils, and a sensuality was introduced by the use of light and shade. As well as the state-sponsored workshops, there were also other private icon workshops sponsored by families such as the Stroganovs. The Stroganovs were a wealthy merchant family who effectively ruled a large part of Russia from their seat in Slovetogorsk. The Stroganov icon school produced small, precious icons of the saints. These were family devotional icons, mainly representing the name patrons of members of the family. This is the sophisticated art of a wealthy class, and the military saints in particular are painted in a delicate, affected style. There were two forces which reacted against the westernising influences in Russian iconography. These, as to be expected, were the monastic workshops and the community of the old ritualists or the old believers. As in most Orthodox countries, monasteries formed an important part of Russian iconography from the very beginning. They were less influenced by outside artistic fashions and retained a pure iconographic style. As Onash and Schneeper say, they retained the obligatory visual patterns set down by the painters' manuals for a longer period than did their secular rivals. Even after they had cautiously opened up to the spirit of the times, icons from this source kept their traditional structural patterns, as well as the liturgically determined choice of colours, and also a stubborn insistence on reverse perspective and the indispensable door to the world of the spirit. The old ritualists, or old believers, come from a split in the Russian Church over the reforms introduced by Patriarch Nikon in the late 17th century. The old believers refused to accept these reforms and sought to preserve ancient church forms, including the form of the icons. This was a persecuted movement, and the icon schools were mostly village-based craft communities, although there were some monasteries in the very far north. The best known of these village schools were Palek, Koloi and Mistera, where icon guilds developed. The final word on the Russian tradition should perhaps be given to its most enthusiastic promoter, Leonid Uspensky. He said, "The Russian icon is the highest expression in art of godlike humility. This is why, in spite of its extremely deep meaning, it has a childlike lightness and joy and is full of tranquil peace and warmth. Having come into contact through Byzantium with the traditions of the ancient world, Russian iconography was not fascinated by the charm of this inheritance. It uses it only as a means to introduce it completely into the church and transfigures it, and thus the beauty of antique art acquires its true meaning in the transfigured countenance of the Russian icon." Now perhaps we might discuss for a little the border kingdoms. The interaction of icons and Western art was most intense in those countries in the border regions where Eastern and Western Christianity encountered each other. In countries such as Romania and Ukraine, regions such as Galicia, the islands such as Cyprus and Crete, and the Empire of Venice, there was a complex artistic interaction. It would be wrong to think that the influence was all one way, Western arts, in a sense, contaminating traditional icons. Traditional iconography had a big influence on Western art, particularly through the use of immigrant Byzantine artists in Venice. Thus, Giotto's painting of the Stigmata of St. Francis follows the pattern of a traditional icon, with a stylized landscape, compressed perspective and gold background, even though its subject comes solidly from the Western tradition. Likewise, in Caravaggio's painting of the Death of the Virgin, in every way a classic late Renaissance painting, Mary is dressed in red and a red cloth is draped across the background, both clear references to traditional iconography. The Western influence on the icons in the border regions was, however, more profound. It involved the use of non-traditional materials. Thus, in Bohemia, icons were painted onto glass and incorporated non-traditional elements or subjects. So it is from Venice that we have a traditional icon of the Dormition of Mary, but with Saints Francis and Dominic standing at the sides. The art of these border regions often shows more realistic and expressive faces, replacing the Byzantine aloofness and more detailed backgrounds. The art of the Crusader kingdoms are superb examples of this. One particular example is worth mentioning, the icon of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. This icon was originated in Crete and is a variant of the loving kindness icons. It has all the hallmarks of the border icons. The faces are expressive and the humanity of Christ is evident. In Russia, this pattern is known as the Mother of the Passion. The original icon was taken to Rome, where it still resides, and it became one of the most popular and reproduced of all icons. For many years, it was the only traditional icon known to Latin Catholics, and it became the centre of a widespread devotional cult. This is still by far the most popular icon in the West. Now let us consider for a moment the Oriental churches. Coptic art is predominantly the Christian art of the Upper Nile Valley in Egypt. It reached its mature phase in the late 5th and 6th centuries. The development of Coptic art was interrupted, of course, by the Arab Islamic conquest of Egypt between 640 and 642. Its subsequent course was marked by iconoclastic Islamic influences and a repetition of earlier forms. In contrast with the aristocratic taste prevailing in cosmopolitan Alexandria, which was in close touch with the leading artistic centres of the Roman Empire, older and deeply ingrained traditions remained in force in the Upper Nile Valley, where an intensely religious culture drew its following chiefly from the lower classes. Coptic art is characterised by a high degree of stylisation, verging on abstraction. Forms are flattened out, and individual motifs acquire bold simplicity and decorative character. The Armenian and Syrian churches were somewhat suspicious of the Byzantine veneration of images. This was mostly because of their support or their sympathy for the teachings of Nestorius on the Incarnation and the nature of Christ. In particular, Armenian theologians rejected the notion that icons are a medium of direct or sacramental representation. This suspicion of images was so great that the churches of the Syro-Malabar Rite, an Oriental church in communion with Rome, had to be instructed to include images in its churches. Now we turn to far-off Ethiopia. One particular church which needs to be discussed is the Ethiopian. This is an ancient Christian church which retains a strong connectedness with ancient Judaism. Almost all of the early imagery of this church, which was probably in the Coptic style, has been lost. This is due to the iconoclast fervour which influenced it from Byzantium, as well as to persistent Islamic influences. The medieval art of Ethiopia shows strong Byzantine influences, although with African elements such as giraffes and antelopes included. These early works also show a strong Islamic influence with complicated geometric and decorative patterns. The Byzantine influence declined, of course, after the fall of Byzantium, with Coptic and Arab models beginning to dominate. Other influences include Indian art through trade contacts and Western European art through Italian and Portuguese travellers. To all of these influences, the Ethiopians brought their own austere style. In the 17th century, the Jesuits had a major influence on the iconography of Ethiopia by introducing prints of Western European art. The typical Ethiopian Madonna, for example, is clearly modelled on a picture of the Virgin Mary in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. Owing to the relative poverty of the Ethiopian church, gold leaf in the background is often replaced with simple yellow paint, giving a very distinctive colour palette to the Ethiopian icons. In far contrast to Ethiopia, let us now go to the very edge of Europe, to the Celtic lands. Another distinctive tradition which we need to discuss, even if only to mourn its loss, is that of the Celts. Here we are talking essentially about the Irish Church, since the other Celtic areas had all come under the dominion of Rome. The Irish iconographic tradition is interesting because it comes from a non-imaging culture, which adopted figurative art along with Christianity. This is in stark contrast to classical civilization, which has to Christianise its already existing strong tradition of figurative art. Unfortunately, most of this Celtic tradition is lost to us because of the violent history of Ireland. This includes particularly the raids of the Vikings, who would destroy anything which they didn't recognise as being of value, such as books and paintings, and of course the savage iconoclasm of the Protestant English, which was particularly savage in Ireland because it was connected to the political attempt to suppress Irish nationality and religion. That the Irish did adopt iconographic art, we know from the few remnants we have. Cormac's Chapel at Cashel was once covered with mosaics. Just enough remains to show that they were brilliantly coloured and also deliberately chipped off. The intricately carved high cross was a feature of many Irish monasteries and seems to have been a catechetical tool. The most complete record left to us of the Irish iconography is in the illuminated manuscripts, which are, ironically, better preserved and more numerous in continental Europe than they are in Ireland. The most famous of these is the Book of Kells, which is preserved in Trinity College, Dublin. The illumination of these documents are highly distinctive. There is a maze of complex geometric decoration. Animals and plants are highly stylised and merged into the geometric pattern. Human figures are rare, but where they exist, they are also highly stylised and lack any sense of realism. The eyes are notably prominent. This combination of highly stylised figures with prominent eyes is very reminiscent of Coptic art, and an Eastern influence in the early Irish Church is not impossible. However, there was clearly no tradition of the true image. Christ is portrayed with blue eyes, red beard and blonde wavy hair. The apostles are shown with red hair. All this suggests an independent and indigenous origin. The loss of the Celtic tradition of iconography is not just the regrettable loss of another cultural view. Celtic spirituality placed great emphasis on God immanent in nature, as opposed to a transcendent emphasis in the Byzantine tradition. Jesus Christ was seen to be incarnate in the natural world, a vital insight for a global society faced with environmental degradation. We have this spirituality preserved in traditional prayers, as can be seen in the excerpt that follows. This is Saint Kieran's prayer, or Kieran. O star-like sun, O guiding light, O home of planets, O fiery manned and marvellous one, O fertile, undulating fiery sea. Forgive. I arise today through the strength of heaven, says Patrick's breastplate. Light of sun, radiance of moon, splendour of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of wind, depth of sea, stability of rock, firmness of earth. In the Carmina Gardelica we read this: there is no plant in the ground, but is full of his virtue. There is no form in the strand, but is full of his blessing. There is no life in the sea, there is no creature in the river, there is naught in the firmament, but proclaims his goodness. There is no bird on the wing, there is no star in the sky, there is nothing beneath the sun, but proclaims his goodness. We have the words of the Celts, but for the great part, their images, which could have spoken to our hearts, are lost to us. Now let us turn to the question of the writing of the icon. Icons have been created in the Orthodox Church in order to externalise the sacred tradition and to enable us who approach them to enter into the unseen world of the Spirit, where we can experience the power of divine grace healing and restoring us in the image and likeness of God. The iconographer, who is engaged in the heavenly task given by God of externalising the sacred tradition in the language of sacred art, where every line and every colour has a meaning, undertakes the writing of the icon in a contemplative atmosphere of prayer. In following the tradition and the artistic rules and conventions of iconography, the iconographer brings the sacred and divine mysteries of the faith before our eyes for our contemplation. draws us past the image to the prototype and brings us into contact with a tradition of Christian spirituality, of inner stillness, attentiveness and recollection that lies at the very heart of the life of the Church. The iconographer's engagement in God's task is not that of a creative artist, but of an instrument in the hands of God, participating in a spiritual journey of prayer. Now we should discuss the visual language of icons. As we enter a world where the silence of the non-verbal symbolic language of form and colour draws us to gaze at the icon in thoughtful contemplation, we discover that we are not looking at a naturalistic work of art. In the stillness of our contemplation, we eventually discover that we are receiving the gaze of the one who looks back at us, knowing us and loving us to a newfound transformation. The sense of stillness and inner recollection that many icons convey is brought about partly through the use of geometric forms, which create a sense of harmony and order. In icons that depict Christ the Saviour as the King of Glory, for example, Christ is surrounded by the shapes of a dark oval mandala and a red diamond and rectangle, which form an octagonal star. The majestic figure of Christ is placed within the red diamond, which is enclosed in the mandala. In the corners of the red rectangle, traced beyond the mandala, are the symbols of the evangelists, receiving rays of light from Christ, who is the centre of the icon. This technique of the combination of geometric shapes not only centres the whole composition, but draws us into the harmony and balance of the icon of Him in whom all things hold together, citing Colossians chapter 1 verse 17. In other icons, a sense of harmony and balance is achieved through the use of a triangular pattern or circle hidden within the icon, which keeps the various elements together. In order to show that the icon refers to the unseen world of the Spirit, the technique of inverse perspective is often employed. In many icons, the lines of perspective do not converge towards a vanishing point in the scene, as they do in ordinary painting, but they diverge into endless space behind the icon, leading our thoughts towards an existence that never ends. Leonid Ouspensky, in his Theology of the Icon, explains, inverse perspective is not an optical illusion. It does not fascinate the spectator and lead one into a futile game of appearances. On the contrary, it calms one, makes one concentrate, and makes one attentive to the message of the icon. It is as if one were standing before a path which, instead of losing itself in space, opens onto infinite fullness. In following the lines of inverse perspective in the opposite direction, we find that the lines converge in the eyes of the beholder. This technique gives the impression that the persons or events represented in the icon are not only looking at us, but are actually coming out to greet us. In this way, a communion is established between the persons or event depicted in the icon and ourselves. In many icons, the figures are noticeably out of scale when compared to the surroundings. This feature of iconography, called hierarchical perspective, where the importance of the figure determines its size, leads us to focus our attention on the important elements in the icon. Curved horizon perspective, the bending of buildings or objects towards the holy figure in the icon, represents a universe transfigured in the light of Christ. Other deliberate distortions of perspective give a view from above as if God was looking down, or from below as of the spectator looking heavenward, or a view from the ground level as the spectator were prostrate at the feet of the saint. These distortions of perspective, which are used often together with inverse and normal perspectives, can lead us to recognize that the world in which we live is also the scene where the events of a spiritual world are taking place. Again, let us listen to Ouspensky and Losky. In order to enter this spiritual world, our minds must be converted, and we must pass through the narrow gate that leads to life. It's quoting Matthew chapter 7. Our own perspective has to be changed as we enter into the realms that the icons open up for us. Communication takes place in the stillness, and the leaving behind of the normal external world leads to the cosmos transfigured in the light of Christ. The theology of transfiguration, the teaching that the light of the transfiguration experienced by Peter and James and John in Matthew 17 was not a created light, but was the uncreated light of divine energy, controls the colour and line of an icon. This uncreated light, which is experienced at the deepest levels of prayer, transfigures us into God's image, from one degree of glory to another, citing 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And through the presence of the saints, it transfigures all of creation. Again in the words of Ouspensky, this ascension of mankind reverses the process of the fall and begins to deliver the universe from disorder and corruption, since the deification attained by the saint constitutes the beginning of the cosmic transformation to come. The iconographer uses the techniques involved with light and colour to show a world and humanity deified by the light of divine energies or grace. The use of gold, an important symbol of divine energy and transformation, in the background of icons and on halos, gives the icon a luminous quality. In addition, the application of liquid gold to parts of the face, clothing, buildings and landscape in the later stages of writing the icon show a world completely surrounded and permeated with light. As we look into the illuminated world of the icon, we discover that the source of light, which is light itself, emanates from within. Unlike our world, which has an external source of light creating shadows that speak of time and corruption, there are no shadows in the world of the icon. The light of divine energies transforms buildings, mountains and vegetation, and is particularly manifested in the inner illumination of the saints. Other colours used to express the light of divine energies and transfiguration are white, red and purple. In the icons of the Nativity and the Transfiguration, white is used to emphasise the divine nature of Christ. Christ is wrapped in white swaddling clothes as an infant and is clothed in a white garment as he is transfigured on the mountain of Tabor. The depiction of Lazarus in a white robe in the icon of the raising of Lazarus represents the illumination of the new life bestowed upon Lazarus by Christ, the incarnate Word of God, who became man so that we might be made divine by grace. Red, blue and purple are the colours used in Mary's maphorion, her cloak, to symbolise that she has put on the light of divine grace. The 3 gold stars on her maphorion symbolise her virginity before, during and after giving birth, and highlight her unique position as the mother of the Son of God. In the icons of martyrs, red is used as a symbol, not of their suffering, but of their glory. Black is used to symbolise that which is waiting to be transfigured, and it can also be used to represent the mystery of God's unknowable essence or divine darkness. In the icons of the Nativity and the Baptism, the darkness of the world or the cave and the dark waters of the Jordan, depicted in the shape of a cave, are transfigured by Christ's entry into them. Just as Christ's descent into the world transfigures all matter, so too Christ's descent into the water transfigures all water, from a symbol of death and chaos to a symbol of life and renewal. The dark semicircle at the top of the icons, suffused with golden rays, symbolises the unfathomable mystery of God. It is dark because God, in God's essence, is unknowable. It has gold rays because God, in God's energies, can be known and experienced. And it is by these energies that God transfigures creation. The centre of the mandala, a circle of light found in many icons, or more correctly, an almond shape of light found in many icons, is often black to symbolise the unknowable essence of God. The movement of the lines in an icon also expresses the theological theme of transfiguration. A good example of where the ascension of the movement from a dark world to a world of glory can be clearly seen is in the icon of the baptism. The most notable non-naturalistic feature in an icon is the way in which buildings are drawn. In the icon of the Annunciation, for instance, one of the pillars is placed directly over a hole in the building behind Mary. Scenes never take place in enclosed walls, since the action that takes place is outside the limits of time and space, that is, everywhere and in front of everyone. In order to indicate that the event took place inside, a red cloth is draped across the building. The cloth is a symbol of the veil which concealed the Holy of Holies in the Old Testament and which is now opened to reveal the Christian message to the world. The non-naturalistic buildings help to show that the event and its significance are not confined to a precise historical moment in time and in space. They belong to the world of the Spirit, to a world of human consciousness that is richer and more mysterious than the ordinary everyday world of rational decisions and logical actions. The wider significance of the events portrayed has to be worked out in the soul of those who behold the icon. What the icon represents may have been manifested at a precise point in time and space, but its fuller significance is found in the inner world, where the true work of purification, illumination and union have to be accomplished. Thus, the non-realistic buildings used as the setting in an icon can open up to us the awareness that it is our own inner world that is being addressed and to which our attention is being directed. The illumination given by a specific event or person is set forth in the icon and has to be accomplished in our souls also. The distorted geometric outlines of the mountains and the design of the patterns of light on the slopes are represented as if they are leaning towards the saint in an attitude of respect, signifying that even the environment has been transfigured by the presence of the saint depicted. Trees and vegetation also acknowledge this presence by bending towards the saint or bursting forth towards the realm of the divine. Examples of the distorted mountains can be seen in the icons of the Nativity, in the baptism, in the raising of Lazarus, and in the Transfiguration. Since mountains are symbolic of the place where God's presence was manifested, the distorted mountains remind us that the event depicted in the icon is one of major spiritual significance. The iconographer's schematic and stylized portrayal of the human form serves to emphasize the dematerialized spiritual form of the person transfigured by divine grace. In the icon of St. Nicholas, for example, the distorted forehead, nose, ears and mouth convey a sense of inner concentration of spiritual energies in attentiveness and prayer. The large, staring eyes that gaze continually at the Lord because they have seen the Lord's salvation also invite us to participate in the divine life. In leading us to turn our gaze towards the interior life of the Spirit, we discover that in order to experience the presence of divine wisdom, symbolized in the high forehead, to receive the inner light and be attentive only to the Lord's voice, the doors of the external world of the senses, symbolized by the long, thin nose, small mouth and ears, must be closed. The depiction of bodies as static and immobile, such as Moses and Elijah in the icon of the Transfiguration, is a technique used to suggest that they are spellbound by the presence of the divine, or that the world in which they live is one of inner peace. Mobility, such as that of Peter, James and John, seen in the same icon, is used to convey the idea of confusion and agitation. Elongated bodies and lengthy fingers indicate dematerialization in the most eloquent way, revealing the flow of spiritual intensity flooding forth from those who are portrayed on the icons. The non-naturalistic shapes of hands and fingers and their positions and gestures in an icon have deep symbolic meaning. In the icons of the Mother of God, of Hodigitria, the one who shows the way, Mary's left hand and fingers point towards her Son. The simple gesture of pointing moves our attention to the incarnate Son of God, who is the way, the truth and the life, as in John 14. This gesture is also common in the icons of the presentation of Mary in the temple, where the gesture of pointing by Joachim and Anna moves our attention towards Mary. The icons of Christ's Pantocrator, in those, Christ's right hand is raised in a gesture of blessing that is turned inwards towards the heart. The way in which the hand is depicted is in a gesture of blessing is described by Dionysius of Furna in his painter's manual as follows. When you paint the blessing hand, do not join the three fingers together, but only cross the thumb and the fourth finger, so that the upright finger, that is to say the index finger, and the bent middle finger denote the name Christ, I-C, since the upright finger denotes the I, and the curved one, which is next to it, the C. The thumb and the fourth finger, which are crossed with the little finger beside it, denote the name XC, Christos. Since the oblique part of the fourth finger, from where it meets the middle finger, makes the X sign, and the little finger, where it is curved, the C. In this way, the name Christos is shown, and through the divine providence of the Creator of all things, the fingers of the hand of mankind are formed in such a way, with neither more nor fewer, but as many as are sufficient to signify this name. This symbol and gesture leads us into the spirituality of the hesychast tradition, where the name of Jesus is closely linked with the prayer of the heart. As well as leading us to embark on the prayer of the heart, the icon forms the door through which we can enter into that interior work. Let us now discuss the painting of icons. The process of creating an icon is a long and complex task involving several different craft techniques, namely the preparation of the panel, the application of the gesso ground, which is plaster mixed with animal glue, the drafting of the composition, gilding of the background, and the painting. The first stage consists of the preparation of a well-seasoned solid wood panel, such as cypress, oak, beech or pine. Some panels need to be strengthened with slats or spleens at the back to prevent them from warping. As the slats or spleens need to be of a harder wood than that of the panel, they often provide useful evidence of the age of the icon. The carving out of a slightly shallow, flat surface in the front of the panel leaves a surrounding border that protects the icon and acts as a partition between that which is holy and the ordinary world. One practical advantage of raised borders is that a ruler or piece of wood may be placed across the icon to allow the hand to be supported during painting. When the wood panel is ready, it is coated several times with glue size, which penetrates and seals the wood. Before the final coat dries, the panel is covered with a thin piece of loosely woven linen. Air pockets and wrinkles are removed by firmly pressing the glue-soaked linen on the surface using one's fingers or a damp cloth. As soon as the linen has been pressed firmly onto the base, it is coated over straight away with more size, so that it is well saturated, and then it is left to dry. The linen serves as an underlayer for the gesso ground on which the icon is to be written. This underlayer is very important because it holds the ground more firmly to the panel, protects the panel from splitting, and prevents the ground from peeling off once the panel begins to warp. When the underlayer is completely dry, a number of layers of the gesso grounding are applied, each of which must be completely dried, cleaned and sanded down to a smooth finish. While the gesso is drying, the iconographer uses the help of other icons or iconographic manuals or handbooks to prepare a basic sketch of the composition. After the drawing is transferred to the gessoed panel, either by using tracing paper or sketching directly onto it with a pencil or tempera colour, the iconographer incises the lines of the drawing with a sharp tool such as a needle or stylus, or a long sharpened nail. This method, which requires great patience and exactness, allows the outlines of the composition to be seen through the paint during the work. Once the outlines of the composition are transferred to the smooth gessoed panel, a decision needs to be made whether to gild, that is with gold leaf, or paint the background of the icon. Of the two methods of gilding, water gilding and oil gilding, the most effective, as it happens, is water gilding. This gilding technique, the oldest and most time-consuming, makes it possible for the gold leaf to be burnished to reflect the light, making it appear as if it was solid gold. The first step involves spreading several coats of bole, that is, soft clay mixed with animal glue, smoothly over the background area where the gold leaf will be placed. After the boled surface has dried, it is rubbed with the finest steel wool, fine emery paper and agate stone until its surface is absolutely smooth. This is most necessary as any scratch or fault will show through the gold leaf when it is applied. Each piece of gold leaf is placed on a gilder's cushion and is cut to shape with a special knife. It is then lifted with a slightly greasy and static gilder's tip and laid carefully on the boled surface, which has been brushed over several times with a solution of thin animal glue and technical spirit. This solution will cement the gold leaf to the boled surface. After a short time, the gold is burnished systematically with an agate burnisher. The more it is burnished and the greater the increase of pressure, the more the gold will shine. The oil gilding technique involves the use of an oil-based, slow-drying glue and the transfer of sheets of gold leaf that are stuck onto sheets of paper by rubbing. Whilst this technique is the simplest of the two, it is not as effective since, due to the matte finish, the gold cannot be burnished. Instead of using gold leaf for the gold background can be painted by hand with egg tempera, a mixture of egg yolk, water and coloured pigments. Once the background is gilded, the actual painting or writing of the icon begins. The painting is built up from darker, which ought to say cooler tones, to lighter, warmer tones in colour and definite consecutive stages. The first painting stage involves the application of the base colour to all areas of the icon. This may be done either by flooding the paint onto the panel or with well-loaded rigger brushes, or by applying the paint in thin coats with flat brushes. In stage 2, the original drawing of the icon is retraced along the incised principal lines and outlines with a darker tone of the same base colour. In the third painting stage, the first layer of lights is applied. Once this is completed, all the painted areas, not the gold background of course, are coated with a transparent, nourishing layer of egg yolk water solution that binds all the layers of colour together. The fourth and final stage involves the painting of letters, halos and gold lines, final build-up of layers of light and slight deepening of shadow areas, reinforcement of lines, final details and highlights. The positioning of the lettering on the panel, which is a reference either to the event or to the saint's name, is planned as an integral part of the whole composition. It is the inscription on the icon which gives its presence. After several months, the icon is varnished and then taken to the church for a blessing. Iconography renders an immense service to the church by revealing in a unique pictorial language the spiritual world of humanity as transfigured by the light of divine energies into the image of Christ. Through the use of colours, forms, lines and expressions, icons announce the good news of the gospel, that God has come amongst us as one of us to call us to become participants in the divine nature, as the second letter of Peter tells us. The implications of this new destiny offered to all who have put on Christ, as Galatians 3 describes, concern not only human beings who are thus reinstated in their royal dignity and office, but also the whole of creation, which is recreated in Christ and called to renewal and transfiguration through the deification of humanity. Icons orient our total being towards transfiguration, and at the same time they help us to decipher every human face as an icon. For every human face is an icon. Beneath all the masks, all the ashes, every human being, however ravaged he or she may be by his or her destiny, by the destiny of history and civilization, carries within him or her the pearl of great price, this hidden face. Iconography assists us in our pursuit of holiness in our everyday lives by reminding us that in our journey towards perfection we are not alone. We are accompanied and sustained by Christ, the Mother of God, and all his saints.